Okay, alright. Let's proceed to the next problem. This time we solve for the resultant of concurrent forces in 3 dimensions. Naman tayo. So, 3 dimensions. Okay, determine the magnitude of the resultant force and the angles between the line of action of the resultant and the reference axis. So, we're going to solve for the direction cosines of the resultant force. So, we have 3 forces here, F1, F2, and F3, with their corresponding magnitudes and directions from the respective axis. No? Hindi ko alam. Ay, tama. Ito yung direction ng F1 from the XY plane. Ito, that's 26 degrees. F2 is 40 degrees from the XY plane. And F3, ito naman 50 degrees. Ayan. So, ulit lang natin yung procedure natin is to solve for the, first we need to solve for the components of each force along X, Y, Z axis. Okay, so let's start with F1. F1. So, kinuha ko to sa module natin. So, may mga, naman sa module, ano? Meron namang mga illustrations doon. Ayan. So, let's try to isolate first yung F1, so forget about F2 and F3 muna. So let's solve muna yung X, Y, Z components of F1. Alright, so this would be F1 isolated from the rest of the forces. Alright, okay, so F1. So this is F1Z, yung red natin, F1Z. F1X component along X, and this is F1Y. So definitely Y is negative because to the left yung kanyang direction, X naman is positive, upwards yung upwards yung Z, so that's positive. Okay. Okay, we're good. So let's solve for, we can directly, immediately solve for F1Z, no? Since ito yung triangle natin, right triangle. So we can directly solve for F1Z. So that's the opposite side. So F1Z, wow, we have already kuryente. So F1Z is simply equal to, let's focus on this figure na lang muna. So F1Z is equal to, so opposite side natin, so 12 sine of 26 degrees. So that is equal to 5.26 kilonewtons. Okay. Yun nga sa module ay tabulated. Most of the solutions are tabulated. So you can also tabulate the components and add them later on. Okay, pwede rin naman yun. But for explanation purposes, kasi yung tabulated medyo na shortcut ng konti yung procedure. but for discussion purposes, I will ganito muna yung presentation natin ng solution. But if you want it to be tabulated, that's fine. Okay, that's fine. It would be better for me kapag nag-check ako na mas maganda yung presentation. Okay, so that's F1Z. Next is to solve for F1X and F1Y. How do you solve for the components of F1 relative to X and Y axis? So, ang kailangan natin, so ito yung F1X and then F1Y. We need to solve for the component of F1, ito, along dito sa may diagonal ng parallelogram na ito. Okay? Along XY plane. So, ito yung kailangan natin pang isolve. Blue na lang natin. Ito. Let's say this is F1 prime. So, after solving for F1 prime, we can now solve for the component of F1 prime relative to X and Y axis. Okay, so what is F1 prime? F1 prime, adjacent side kanina. So adjacent side natin. So 12 cosine of 26 degrees. So what is F1 prime? That is 10.6 786 kilonewtons. Okay? It's F1 prime. So after solving for F1 prime, kunin natin yung component niya along F1, along X. That will be F1X already. And then, kunin natin yung component niya along F1, along Y. So that will be F1Y already. Okay? So F1X is equal to F1 prime adjacent side, so cosine of 42 degrees. So that is 10.786 cosine of 42 degrees. That should be 8.015 kilonewtons. And then F1Y is equal to opposite side F1 prime, which is 10.786 sine of 42 degrees. So that is equivalent to negative, by the way, that should be negative. Kasi nga, pag ganun yung direction ng F1 prime natin. So that should be negative. So negative 7.217 kilonewtons. Okay, solve na tayo sa F1. So meron na tayong F1X. Meron na rin tayong F1Y at meron na rin tayong F1Z. Okay? Next. Okay, next is we solve for the components naman of F2. Components of F2 along X, Y, Z axis. Again, we can easily solve for the component of F2 along Z. So given natin yung triangle na ito, so F2Z is simply equal to 18. Ito yung F2 natin. Opposite side siya, so sine of 40 degrees. So remember this 40, baka hindi nyo masyadong makakita. This is a vertical angle yan, vertical angle. Ganun din sa previous na, sa F1 kanina. So sine of 40 degrees. Okay? So, that's equivalent to 11.570 kilonewtons. Okay? Next, we solve also for, before we can solve for F2x and F2y. So remember, this F2x, again, negative siya. F2y is also negative, no? So, pag ganun yung direction ng F2y, pag ganun naman yung direction ng F2x, so both components are negative. So, first, we need to solve for the component of F2 relative to this axis. Ito yung diagonal ng parallelogram natin along XY plane. So, that is, let's say, F2 prime, yung blue. After which, we can now solve for F2x and F2y. Okay, so first, solve for F2 prime. So adjacent side siya. So 18 cosine of 40 degrees. That is equivalent to 13.789 kilonewtons. Let me see. Tama ba yun? Calculate ko lang. 18 cosine of 40. Tama. Okay. So, next, after solving for F2 prime, we can now solve for F2x and F2y. So, F2x is directed ganon, so negative siya. So, negative F2 prime, so 13.789. It's the opposite side, so we're going to use sine. 35 degrees. So that is equivalent to negative 7.909 kilonewtons. And then F2y is equal to F2y natin. Adjacent side siya. So negative din. So minus F2 prime adjacent, so cosine 35 degrees. So negative f2y is negative 11.295. Okay? Ayan. So solve na yung f2 natin. We have f2x, we have f2y, and we have f2z. Okay, next naman, f3. I-resolve ulit natin kung ano yung components along x, y, z axis. Okay. So we can easily solve for f3z. f3z is equal to opposite side, upwards yung direction is positive. So we have 25 sine of 50 degrees. So f3z is 19.151 kilonewtons. And then again, we need to solve for f3 prime along this line. The component of f3 along this diagonal, let's say that is f3 prime. After solving for f3 prime, we can now solve for f3y and f3x. Okay, so this is 60 degrees, which means that this is 90 degrees yan, so this is 30 degrees. Okay, or you can use naman, blurred pala kanina, you can use naman this angle. Okay, alright, so let's solve muna f3 prime. So f3 prime is equal to 25 adjacent, so cosine of 50 degrees. So f3 prime is 16.07 kilonewtons. Is it really? Cosine of 50. Tama. Okay. Now we can solve for f3x. So f3x, ito, opposite side ng 30 degrees. So we have 16, again, f3x is positive, ganun yung kanyang direction. So positive siya. So we have 16.07 sine of 30 degrees. Or you can use itong angle na to, 60, but it should be cosine, itong side na to. Cosine siya. You can also use 30, but it should be sine because it's the opposite side, opposite of the angle. So f3x is equal to 8.035. And f3y is equivalent to, what is f3y? So f3y is equal to 16.07 adjacent ng 30 degrees. So cosine 30, that is equal to 13.917 kilonewtons. So kompleto na tayo sa f3. We have f3x, f3y, and f3z. So lahat na nasolve na natin yung components. Now we add all x components, y components, and z components. Alright? So let's do that. So next na lang. Yan na lang. Okay, add all components along x, y, and z. So summation of forces along x, or that is actually Rx, is equal to, hindi pala kita. Ayan. So F1x is 8.015. plus f2x. So plus f2x is negative 7.909 plus f3x 8.035. So that is equivalent to, so Rx is equal to 8.141 kilonewtons. And then we also solve for the summation of forces along y. So lahat ng y components is also equal to the y component of the resultant force. So Ry is equal to minus 7.217. This is F1y. Plus F2y, that is minus 11.295. Plus F3y, that is 13.917. So Ry is equal to negative 4.595 kilonewtons. Okay, next, summation of forces along Z axis. So yeah, it's also equal to the Z component of the resultant force. So F1Z is 5.26 plus F2Z, that is 11.57 plus F3Z, that is 19.151. So Rz is 35.981 kilonewtons. Now we can solve for the resultant. The resultant is the square root of the quantity Rx squared. So Ry squared plus Rz squared. So we have Rx plus Ry squared plus Rz squared. So the resultant is 37.176 kilonewtons. So that is the resultant of the three concurrent forces. We are also required to solve for the angle. So by the way, ito yung figure natin for the location of the resultant. No? So take note, Rx is positive. So nandito siya. Ry is negative. So nandun yung y. And Rz is positive. So nandito siya sa quadrant na ito, yung resultant natin. And we are to solve for these angles. The direction of that force, the resultant force relative to the positive axis, x, y, z axis. Yeah. Okay? So how do you solve for the directions natin? So we've discussed this before. No? So theta x is equal to the arctangent of Rx over yung resultant. Okay, so Rx natin is 8.141. Ang resultant force natin is 37.176. So theta x is 77.35 degrees. And theta y is equal to, sorry, that should be arc cosine. Dito na ako. So the arc cosine of, kasi these are direction cosines, no? So the arc cosine of Rx over Ry, that is theta x. So we have derived this before, no? Sa previous videos natin. We have discussed this before. So theta y is equal to the arc cosine of So we have Ry, which is negative 4.595 over, so that is equal to 97.1 degrees. Ito yung theta y natin. So that should exceed 90 degrees. Ayan. So theta z naman natin is the arc cosine of Rz, which is 35.981 over 37.176. That is 14.57 degrees. So these are the direction cosines of the resultant force. Okay? Okay. So that's it. These are the answers. So we'll have another example sa next na video.